Hey everyone, I'm Jeremy Szafron, and this is Kitco News. Now, in a surprising turn, the U.S. economy added a robust 353,000 jobs this January, far outpacing expectations and signaling a labor market that remains surprisingly resilient. A strong job growth and the unemployment rate held steady at 3.7%, and all eyes are on the Federal Reserve as it balances its dual mandate in an inflationary environment. Chairman Jerome Powell's recent comments on 60 Minutes have been a focal point for understanding the Fed's next moves. Powell expressed cautious optimism, acknowledging the significant progress on inflation, but emphasized that the Fed's commitment to ensuring this trend continues towards their 2% target. Now, he highlighted the need for more evidence of sustainable progress before considering adjustments to interest rates. Joining us to unpack all of this is Claudia Sahm, former U.S. Federal Reserve economist and founder of Sahm Consulting. She's known for her contribution to the macroeconomic policy, specifically for developing the Sahm rule, a tool used to identify recessions in real time based on changes in unemployment rate. Claudia, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Now, we got so much to unpack. We were talking a little bit off camera about this interview. There's lots to get to. Before, though, I'm curious, with the latest job numbers significantly exceeding expectations, how do you interpret the health of the U.S. economy? And is this the reality on the ground? I mean, I see a lot of government jobs in these numbers as well.
So Jobs Day was a good day. I mean, those numbers were really impressive. And there were government jobs. The state and local government. This wasn't really even about the federal government. State and local it's been so hard for them to hire because they weren't able to raise wages in a lot of ways. We need those teachers, right? So that's good. And yet there were gains across the board. Like, this was a very broad-based. There'd been some concerns the month before that it were just a couple sectors, state and local and healthcare. This time, no, we saw it. I mean, this was a really big number, right? You're going to see it in a lot of places. That was very good. You can always go in and find some things to quibble with. And, nothing is just because we had a good month. And frankly, we've had several good months, a couple of years.
Yeah.
Does not mean that as we go forward in this year, that it's guaranteed. And frankly, not every month is going to be like that last month. Like, that was just, knock it out of the park big.
Yeah, huge. With such robust job numbers, though, is there a concern that inflationary pressures might continue to persist? And of course, this would complicate the Fed's effort to steer towards its inflation target here.
So anything can happen, as we've learned in the last 4 years. Now, we did see in last year in particular, notable progress in inflation coming down. We've had 6 months of really good inflation numbers, and Powell recognized that in his interview on 60 Minutes. And at the same time, and very importantly, growth stayed high, right? Above what would be kind of normal growth. Unemployment has been below 4% for the longest stretch since the 1960s. So last year, we didn't have to give up growth to get inflation down. Well, that's because we're, unwinding COVID disruptions, things that were, in fact, temporary. So, yes, there's a logic to it. Yeah, when wages are big, you got more money to go out and spend. And yet we haven't seen that dynamic. And we have this other thing going on that can help support it, which is productivity growth has been higher. And that can allow us to, run a little faster without creating inflation because we've got the supply to meet the demand.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, we're talking a lot about this 60 Minutes interview, but everyone is today. And the Fed's progress on inflation isn't necessarily complete here. Given your expertise, what's good data? And what do you think that the Fed will be looking for to feel confident in adjusting the policy stance here?
Every step towards 2%. Right. Yeah. They're one of their target measures. So looking at personal consumption expenditure, inflation, taking out food and energy. I mean, that piece is important too, but just for like where we're at, kind of where we're going to stay on trend, that now is below 3%. It's been a long time since we saw that. And it has moved down at a notable pace. And there's a lot in the works that looks like it's going to keep going. One aspect of the Fed's stance right now that I find frustrating is Powell has said multiple times, other Fed officials, we will not wait until 2% to cut. They'll do their first interest rate cut before that. Now, he also said March is off the table. Okay. So that means May would be the earliest. They meet at the beginning of May to do their first interest rate cut. By that point, they'd have 9 months of data, presumably good data. They could be getting really close to 2. The last 6 months, the pace is under 2, right? So,
Right.
like, they're going to have to, I realize they want to get confident, they want to see more, but there is a tension between we're not going to cut before 2. And frankly, by the time they get to 2, by inflation is at 2, the Fed should be out of the way. Like interest rates should be back at kind of a place where they're not really doing much anything. And I don't know how they're going to get there given how fast inflation is going down and how slow they are. But it's the Fed. I mean, none of this surprises me. I disagree with it, but like, come on.
Right.
Like, it's the Fed.
Yeah. And the market had six cuts priced into it. Now they're thinking it could be closer to 3. How do you assess the balance between being too cautious and acting prematurely here?
The Fed has, I've written about this in the, there's buffers. There is a margin for error that the Fed, frankly, shouldn't have, or is very unusual. Like, it goes back to fiscal policy, and a lot of the COVID was disruptive in ways we haven't seen before. So we have a very strong job market. We have families that have more money in the bank than before COVID. I mean, there was a lot of money put out from CARES Act all the way through Rescue Plan. We have that. There's still appears to be some pricing power. The businesses are, it's slipping through their grasp. And so that can help. That was extraordinary and very specific to COVID and Ukraine. So they can wind that down. And the list goes on. Like, there's a lot of, and inflation's been coming down very fast, right? So they've got some margin for error. Now, I disagree with the Fed calling it, they have the luxury of time, right? The economy is so strong, so they can wait. And it's like, you should not be rolling the dice on American workers. I mean, the reality is when I see Friday's numbers, I'm like, okay, it's even less likely. And I think it's a pretty low risk, but it's even less likely that the Fed is going to destroy the soft landing. That doesn't mean, I think they should be using that as they shouldn't be their security blanket, right? Like, they should be doing their mandate.
But should they be doing these, cut decreases in March, in your opinion? Should they be going a little quicker here?
Right. On the data that we have in hand, one could make the argument they should have already cut. Now, again, I'm not asking for 200 basis points, 2 percentage points at one meeting. It's this, we want to do it gradually, a 1/4 percentage point, every meeting, maybe every other meeting, just kind of see how it goes. One thing the Fed has also said, I don't think this definitely comes out at the press conference and some of their more like market audience discussions. They see it as a huge mistake if they start cutting and then they have to raise. Like, if inflation would come back. So that's why they want to be so sure. And yet, the world hits us with things and you adjust, right? To me, the worst possible outcome is not they cut and have to raise. The worst possible outcome is we have an unnecessary recession.
Right.
Yeah. So but this is the Fed being overly cautious. It's them kind of still psychologically stuck in the 1970s. I mean, there's a lot of baggage they're carrying around right now. And I mean,
no one wants to be wrong.
No one wants to be Arthur Burns.
Right.
No one wants to be. And that's actually pretty important in the election year, too, because in addition to Arthur Burns, who was then the Fed chair in the 70s, cutting as soon as unemployment started to drift up a little bit. And then after that, inflation came back more. He also directly coordinated with Nixon during his reelection to keep rates low. So this is like double whammy. Like, the Fed does not want to, on either dimension, look like Burns or frankly, like, cause the damage that did. So I understand it. And again, because there are so many buffers, I don't think it's going to matter. But there are risks. Yeah. The Fed is our biggest risk this year.
Right. Well, I'm curious, Claudia, because you and I were chatting a little bit about this. I mean, traditionally, the Fed's supposed to be pretty far from the other Feds in terms of independence. But I want to read a quote from the Jerome Powell interview on 60 Minutes. He said, "The U.S. federal government is on an unsustainable fiscal path, and that just means that the debt is growing faster than the economy. We're borrowing from future generations."
In the long run, the U.S. is on an unsustainable fiscal path. The U.S. federal government's on an unsustainable fiscal path. And that just means that the debt is growing faster than the economy.
So, Claudia, talk to me a little bit about the debt of the country. It's topping $33 trillion. How does this become more sustainable? Can the current economic environment even handle it? And should he be commenting on these at all?
So first, there is absolutely no reason that Jerome Powell, as Fed chair, should have commented on the federal debt last night on 60 Minutes. Right? There's no excuse for that. There is a longstanding tradition that the Fed chair does not comment on fiscal policy. Right? You want to stay out of politics? Well, don't talk about a politically charged issue. So that just blew me away. That was a complete unforced error, and the Fed will pay for that. Jay Powell will pay for that. That should not have been said. Although I think he believes that as a person, right? And I know plenty of people in Washington, D.C. and outside that believe that. But when Powell speaks, he speaks for the Fed, not for himself. The Fed should have and does not have any opinion on the path of the federal debt. So, but to your other question, which I think is important, and this was the second thing that I was having a hard time absorbing his comments, is I recently wrote a piece at Bloomberg Opinion making the argument that the debt's okay, right? That the conversation we should be having are about our tax and spend priorities. We should not be setting, there is no magic number. There's a total, the United States has the ability to borrow. We're a dynamic country. People want our debt. We ought to be doing fiscal policy that makes sure we stay a dynamic country, that people want our debt, right? It's not about the number. And in particular, the comment about generations, is just it's gotta go, because there's a lot of things we do for future generations. As one example, we invest in climate change mitigation, ways to do it. I would rather give my grandchildren, great-grandchildren, a habitable planet than worry about their tax bill. Or more right now is, the child tax credit. Do you give money to children? Right? To me, we're off track if the discussion stays at this high level of $34 trillion, the high level of the path of debt, as opposed to what are we doing here? And I mean, the amount of hate mail I got from that one piece was quite amazing. And that's why I know. No, and that's why, in particular, seeing him wade into that conversation, I know it is very politicized, or it's a hot button. I mean, you can find Democrats who would agree with him as well. It's a hot button issue. It is one being debated actively in Congress right now. Why put the Fed inside of that? You could have just said, not going to comment.
Well, and it's a tough one, too, because obviously we're going into an election year. And what this is signaling is that, Powell and the Fed might start taking these interest rate cuts just prior to the actual election itself. So how are they going to skirt this balance of remaining independent when this is all going on? I just made this comment about bringing politics to the Fed by talking about fiscal policy. I firmly believe that the Fed will not make its decisions based on this is an election year. Right.
One thing I would say is you have a very mixed political affiliation at the Federal Open Market Committee. In just a day, Powell, for example, is chair. He was first appointed a governor by Obama. Trump appointed him to chair, and then Biden reappointed him. And he is a registered Republican, but I mean, my goodness, these are all kinds of different directions. And none of these people had he worked closely with personally, right? And that was a part of the Arthur Burns-Nixon coordination. So I am not worried about the Fed doing any kind of direct interference with the election, kind of putting their thumb on the scale for one party or the other. Now, the decisions they make and the effects on the economy will put a thumb on the scale. And they know that. But I really do believe they're making their decisions without that. The one that's going to be really, if you look at it, is going to be hard to piece out. It is part of being absolutely confident that inflation is 2% before they cut. That gives them about as much political cover, at least from the Republicans, as they're going to get. Now, Elizabeth Warren may be like just on fire by that point because the Democrats want the cut. So I kind of get what they're doing with this. Like if they would have cut at the last meeting, which I think they could have, it would have been really hard to make the case. Oh, no.
Right.
This is what we think. We're making a forecast. It'll keep coming down. Like they're going to really want to like go with the data as opposed to where they think the data are going, which is not
Right.
how
Yeah.
the Fed is supposed to work. But I think there's just a lot of things. And I don't think that's all politics, but they're going to be cautious. I do not subscribe to the view that, oh, they can't cut in October. They can't cut in December. I don't think that's, it may be that they do not do that, but I'm still a believer in like they're gonna just do their job and try to
Is that your prediction? Based on the current data and trends, what are your predictions for the U.S. economy and the Fed's policy through to the end of this year?
I've been of the opinion that this entire cycle has had very little to do with the Fed. I mean, I am supportive that they raised interest rates when inflation went up. I would not have raised them quite as high as they did or as fast as they did. But this has been COVID inflation. Putin came in and especially like the 2023 pattern, it was so clear. It's like, oh yeah, this was a disruption we're unwinding. Right. So, but that, Jay Powell did not go pump oil. He did not take a second job. He did not unload the docks in LA. Right. Like the things that really needed to happen to get inflation back down, that was not the Fed. Right. I mean, they were there and they played a role. There was a massive amount of fiscal policy that went out that really kickstarted the labor market. The Fed's tools, I mean, you jigger around interest rates versus sending people $1,400, right? Like the effects of fiscal are just so much stronger. So the Fed has been there. Like I said, they're the risk for this year. I mean, if the Fed makes this last mile about themselves, it will be a problem. Right. Like if
it's interesting. I'm curious, Claudia. I know that you're super busy, but if you're advising the Fed today, what would be your recommendations for handling this delicate balance that we've been talking about? Fostering economic growth, controlling inflation. What would you be doing differently?
First, I would tell them Godspeed. I mean, they're trying to navigate an incredibly difficult situation, and they are balancing so many concerns, and it's clear among the FOMC, and I think this is part of why they're being slow to act. It's the data. They want to be sure. It's clear they have a lot of different opinions on the FOMC. The FOMC acts by consensus. So, and there are some problems with that, but in general, like you want to have a group of world-class experts who are public servants, look at the data, look through the options, and do the best they can. So at that level, I just like keep it up, right? Like I don't always agree with them, but they know more than I know. They're making decisions. Their names are the ones on the line, not mine. All that said, I really, the thing I would want them to rethink is this luxury of time issue, like this idea that we can wait because things are so good. Because if you wait too long, we lose that. And I'm also would like to see them be more attuned to it. And they may be in private, but some of Powell's remarks about commercial real estate and it being like, oh, we got this under control. It's all right. And it's like, I was just having flashbacks to Bernanke subprime is contained comment. I was like, don't do that. And they can't freak out in public. And there's no reason to scare people. And yet the Fed, in my opinion, has been unwilling to admit that they are part of that problem, right? The interest rates are high. This has put stress on CRE. There are other parts of credit markets and banks in particular. I mean, they've been holding it together with interest rates that went up really fast, really high, and totally unexpected, right? And so the idea is now, oh, the rates are going to come down. So like we can power through it. The longer they wait, the more it might be fine right now, but it might not be fine in 6 months. And the Fed got really lucky in some sense how quickly they got Silicon Valley Bank under control. If they can't pull that off the next time, if there is a next time and they can't pull that off, that can spill back into the quote unquote real economy. And that's the risk I worry about. And he was more sanguine than I would have
Yeah.
liked.
He seemed to be talking more about the large banks as opposed to the smaller community banks in expressing that they'll be fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I worry about that one. But it's a risk.
Right.
Again, this is not, and I don't know what the channel would be. There is an old saying, the Fed goes until it breaks something. And the breaking something is typically in financial markets. So I don't know what it is they'll break. And we've been talking about commercial real estate for a while. So that one may well be under control. And yet the Fed may not have the luxury of time in financial markets. And it's not their job to do, well, actually, as a bank supervisor, that is their job. But in terms of, financial stability, that's not supposed to be done with monetary policy. And yet you break something big, it could come back and break, your ability to hit the dual mandate. So I just haven't heard enough recognition of this. And so that always makes me worried. Like your blind spots are what gets you.
Interesting. So commercial real estate and obviously the banks as well. Keeping an eye on those.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great. Claudia Sahm, former U.S. Federal Reserve economist and the founder of Sahm Consulting, joining us today. Claudia, really appreciate your insights. So much to get into, and I hope you can come back on and explain some of this stuff to us again soon. Thanks again.
Great. Thank you.
And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for the latest news. And until next time, I'm Jeremy Szafron. We'll see you next time.